Authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled International Financial Institutions in an Era of Great Power Competition. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. First, thank you for your very impressive set of witnesses. What is this? Apologize for that. Thank you we'd like to thank our very impressive set of witnesses for being here today. You possess tremendous expertise on the U.S. dollar and global economics, and we look forward to your insights. The U.S. dollar has been the preferred global currency since the end of World War II, providing our nation inherent economic advantages as well as responsibilities. Today, an estimated 88% of all currency transactions by value are conducted in U.S. dollars. Among other things, this limits the risk of a balance of payments crisis, which inherently lowers our exchange rate risk. The dollar's position also allows the United States and Americans to borrow at rates such as 50 to 60 basis points lower. Our currency strength not only benefits the United States government, but also helps the American consumers by lowering the price of imported goods, resulting in an estimated $25 to $45 billion a year in savings. Further, the dominant dollar offers investors dependability and a safe haven in times of economic uncertainty, as seen during the 2008-09 financial crisis, and more recently in the economic shock caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Finally, possibly the most important advantage of having the global reserve currency within our country is embedded in the title of our subcommittee, National Security. The dollar status allows us to apply powerful economic sanctions, which, when used properly as in a targeted tool, can alter our adversaries' actions in a way that advances U.S. and global security. Today, the biggest threat to American and global security is the Chinese Communist Party. Next week, Treasury Secretary Yellen will appear before our committee, and one thing that I hope to find out is, does this administration have a plan for when China inevitably attacks Taiwan? I asked the same question of Secretary Nelson in April and was not impressed by his answer. I asked that same question of Chairman Powell and was not impressed with his answer. We have concerns about that. Committee Republicans seeing the writing on the wall and have acted decisively by putting forward meaningful legislation. I only hope that the administration also has some foresight. Sanctions are a powerful tool, and their use should not be considered lightly. As such, diverse opinions exist on the effectiveness of the U.S. approach to sanctions. Some believe that carrying out sanctions too broadly rather than in a targeted manner can have a negative effect and ultimately undermine dollar dominance. Others believe we should use every tool in our kit to maximum effect. Because of the formidable impact that even U.S. unilateral sanctions can have, adversaries and even some friends have sought alternative payment methods and systems. It is anticipated that when the BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have their annual summit this summer, they will discuss the feasibility of a common currency mechanism for trade among their countries as an alternative to the dollar. Other countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Argentina, the UAE, Algeria, Egypt, Bahrain, and Indonesia have also expressed interest in such a mechanism. While I don't think this idea is practical in the moment, something like it could materialize in a not-so-distant future. China is also engaged in creating an alternative in the form of a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, which the Chinese Communist security agencies intend to use to surveil the financial activity of any user. Because the ECNY presents an assault on financial privacy and is a risk to our national security, introduced H.R. 804, the Chinese CBDC Prohibition Act of 2023. This bill prohibits U.S. money service businesses from engaging in transactions involving a central bank digital currency issued by China. Eventually, the United States will need to make a decision. Do we open the door to the expansion of CCP's digital dollar, or do we slam it shut? My bill slams the door and locks it. Finally, our own domestic actions should make dollar-based assets less attractive, particularly the unsustainable federal spending trajectory and the resulting inflation that's spread around the world. We must take this risk seriously. It is all too clear that inflation is undermining U.S. national security. The good news is that despite attempts by the Chinese government and other bad actors, the dollar seems secure for now, as there is no clear or immediate alternative to serve as a global reserve currency. But to ensure that remains the case, we must keep our eye on the ball and preserve and protect this key national asset. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today to discuss the preservation of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, a topic which we all agree is of the utmost importance. The U.S. dollar is considered the global reserve currency because roughly 60% of central bank reserves around the world are held in U.S. dollars. The dollar is the preferred currency for international trade. Oil is priced and settled in U.S. dollars, and nearly 90% of transactions in foreign exchange markets involve, yes, the dollar. The market for U.S. Treasuries is also the deepest and most liquid market in the world, and the reliability and stability of U.S. capital markets makes the dollar the preferred currency for investors. The dominance and supremacy of the currency affords the United States numerous benefits, from reduced borrowing costs to increased financial stability to influence over global financial markets. It also allows us to leverage economic measures against those that seek to threaten our national security and foreign policy. Given the undeniable value of the U.S. dollar's dominance, it is critical that we address the currency and the present threats to it. As we speak, foreign adversaries like Russia and China are actively working to undermine the U.S. dollar and cripple our global power and influence. We see this in Russia's rapid accumulation of gold reserves over the last decade, as well as China's development of non-SWIFT systems to settle and clear transactions involving the RMB. Furthermore, several other countries are pushing efforts to bypass use of the U.S. dollar in the U.S.-led financial system. That is why I agree that the subject of this hearing unquestionably deserves our time and attention in Congress and in this subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. However, I can't help but note the irony of my colleagues holding this hearing after months of threatening a default on our debt that would undermine the strength of the U.S. dollar. While we're discussing the threats of the dollar's dominance, let us not forget that the biggest threat to the dollar is political brinkmanship and hostage-taking, a tactic that we witness by the other side of the aisle that conspicuously employed only when a Democrat is in charge. It is paramount that we preserve the trust and confidence that the world has in the ability of the United States to pay its debt. Just yesterday, our Financial Service Institution Subcommittee hearing on the debt ceiling and Treasury Department calculations, our witnesses unanimously agreed that defaulting on the debt would greatly damage to replace us on the global stage. After once again coming within hours of defaulting on our debt and collapsing our economy, perhaps it is time to consider measures that would prevent the weaponization of the debt ceiling debate. The U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar is not a political tool. I look forward to continuing the efforts of my fellow committee Democrats who have led the charge to protect and promote the United States competition and our standing on the global stage. Once again, I thank our witnesses for their presence here today, and I look forward to our testimony. And with 1 second, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we'll go to our witnesses for today. Tyler Goodspeed. Dr. Goodspeed is the Klein-Heinz Fellow at Stanford University. Michael Falkender. Dr. Falkender is the Dean's Professor of Finance at the University of Maryland and Chief Economist at America First Policy Institute. Daniel McDowell. Dr. McDowell is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University and Wilson China Fellow at the Wilson Center. Michael Billingsley. Mr. Billingsley is a Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute. And Carla Norloff. Professor Norloff is a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Professor at the University of Toronto. We thank each of you for taking time to be here. Each of you would be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of our testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements would be made part of the record. And we would ask you to speak into the microphone. Those boxes move forward. pull it toward you, act like you're going to take a bite out of the microphone. The reason I want you to speak loudly into that is we do have somebody who's recording, stenographer taking this down, and she needs to be able to hear what you say very clearly. So besides that, I'm getting old and my hearing is a little less than it should be. So I appreciate the indulgence. Dr. Goodspeed, last time I saw something of Dr. Goodspeed, it was a movie with trying to help somebody take over the former Alcatraz prison. But good morning, welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Lutkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, members of the committee. I am a Klein-Heinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and Chief Economist at Greenmantle, LLC, a global macroeconomic and geopolitical advisory firm. From 2017 to 2021, I had the privilege to serve on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as Senior Economist, Chief Economist for Macroeconomic Policy, Member, and Acting Chairman. In 2022, as the Ranking Member highlighted, 88% of all foreign exchange transactions by value involve the United States dollar, a figure that has been roughly constant since 1989, which is testament to the substantial path dependence in international currency usage due to large positive network externalities. As the Ranking Member also highlighted, 59% of all official foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars, which is down from a figure of 71.5% in 2001. By comparison, 31% of all foreign exchange transactions by value involved the euro, which is the second most commonly transacted currency, which accounted for 20% of official foreign exchange reserves. The fact that 90% of all foreign exchange transactions continue to involve the United States dollar and that global central banks continue to hold almost 60% of their foreign exchange reserves in US dollars confers net economic benefits on the United States economy. First, foreign demand for reserves of US dollars raises demand for dollar-denominated securities, in particular United States Treasuries. This effectively lowers the cost of borrowing for US households, US companies, and federal, state, and local governments. It also means that on average, the United States earns more on its investments in foreign assets than we have to pay on foreign investments in the United States, which allows the United States to import more goods and services than we export. Second, foreign demand for large reserves of US dollars and dollar-denominated assets raises the value of the dollar, and a stronger dollar benefits US consumers and businesses that are net importers of goods and services from abroad. Third, large reserve holdings of US currency abroad in effect constitutes an interest-free loan to the United States worth about $10 to $20 billion per year. Fourth, the denomination of the majority of international transactions in US dollars likely modestly lowers the exchange rate risks faced by US companies. Fifth, given the volume of foreign US dollar holdings and dollar-denominated debt, monetary policy actions by foreign central banks generally have a smaller impact on financial conditions in the United States than actions by the United States Central Bank have on financial conditions in other countries. However, the benefits of the US dollar's global reserve status are not without costs. Though lower interest rates in the United States benefit US borrowers, especially the federal government, they also lower returns to US savers. In addition, though a stronger dollar benefits US consumers and businesses that net import goods and services from abroad, it does also disadvantage US firms that export goods and services abroad, as well as firms that compete against imported goods and services. Furthermore, the perception of the US dollar as a safe haven asset means that demand for the dollar tends to increase in response to adverse macroeconomic events that are global in nature. As a result, the competitiveness of US exporters and US firms that compete against imported goods and services are likely to face an increased competitive disadvantage at times of elevated global macroeconomic stress. However, despite these costs, studies generally find that the economic benefits of the dollar's prominent global status outweigh the costs, providing a modest net benefit to the United States economy. This does not include the substantial benefit to which the chairman referred of the United States dollar's centrality in global transactions, allowing the United States to utilize financial sanction tools when appropriate, in support of national security objectives. There are economic policies that would help to preserve this net economic benefit. Prudent fiscal policy, avoiding excessive levels of regulation that would allow for continued financial innovation to occur within the United States rather than without, restoring low and stable inflation. I look forward to your questions and participating in this important economic discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Goodspeed. Dr. Falkender, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Beatty, and members on the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on dollar dominance, federal fiscal mismanagement, and the implications for our nation's economy. I had the honor of serving as Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Department of Treasury during the previous administration. In that role, I worked with members on both sides of the political aisle and the Small Business Administration to quickly implement the Paycheck Protection Program and ensure that the economic devastation that might have resulted from the pandemic was not realized. As Assistant Secretary, I told my team that the Treasury Secretary proudly states that the dollar will never not be the world's reserve currency, and our job is to make sure that's true. Maintaining that role means engaging in prudent economic stewardship, continuously upgrading the technology supporting the nation's payment system, and showing restraint in our deployment of unilateral sanctions. Most importantly, we must demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are financially responsible by addressing our unsustainable fiscal path. To understand why this is the case, we must start with the role of money. The academic literature has identified 3 purposes of money. Number 1, facilitate exchange of goods and services. 2, serve as a store of value from when the money is received until it is used. And 3, act as a unit of measurement. One reason the dollar is the world's reserve currency is because approximately half of global trade is invoiced in US dollars, even though US trade only accounts for approximately 10% of global trade. Some countries peg their currency to the dollar, bringing greater stability to their trade with the United States by removing currency risk. However, to keep the peg in place, those countries must also adopt the interest rates of the US Federal Reserve, causing interest rate effects here to be exported abroad. Foreign companies operating in non-dollar pegged currencies may still invoice in dollars because they want a currency easily converted and that stores value in the interim. As has been recognized by both the chairman and the ranking member, a significant portion of trading in spot, forward, and swap markets feature the US dollar in one leg of the transaction. Our financial markets are the most liquid in the world. Transactions are implemented at low cost with fast execution and minimal price impact. Thus, part of maintaining our role as the world's most transacted currency means keeping our markets open with ongoing improvements in technology that speeds order implementation while safeguarding against illicit transactions and cybersecurity threats. Most importantly, dollar dominance is aided by policies that reinforce the dollar's historical strength and stability. When fiscal and monetary policy generate robust economic growth with low inflation, the US dollar is stronger and less volatile, thus serving the important second role of money as a store of value. In contrast, stagnant growth and high inflation do not serve foreign transactors looking to mitigate currency risk. During COVID-19, aggressive fiscal policy was essential to ensure that our nation's families and small businesses survived its devastation. By January 2021, the economy had nearly fully recovered from the pandemic. Nevertheless, Congress and the administration enacted an additional $1.9 trillion in federal spending, resulting in the highest inflation our nation has endured in 40 years. Even last year, well after the pandemic had ended, federal spending was still 24% of national output, significantly above its 20% average that existed between 1980 and the onset of the pandemic. Under current projections, our debt is anticipated to reach 566% of national output by the end of the 75-year forecast period in the financial report of the U.S. government. Our growing debt erodes confidence around the world that the U.S. will continue being a responsible economic steward worthy of status as the world's reserve currency. Given the outsized role of the federal government in our economy, recent growth has been anemic. Inflation is still well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Inflation-induced interest rate hikes have resulted in 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in U.S. history. Yet there seems to be an insistence on throwing more gasoline on the stagflation fire. Washington-directed spending that replaces low-cost, reliable sources of energy with high-cost, unreliable sources of energy creates both inflation and contraction. The Federal Reserve cannot alone mitigate the inflationary impacts of fiscal and regulatory policy. Higher interest rates further undermine the banking system and erode the value of the dollar. Instead, the Federal Reserve needs help from Congress and the administration. They should reduce federal spending, rescind regulations that are curtailing economic growth, and devaluing the dollar. Policymakers must return to the responsible fiscal stewardship that made the U.S. the premier economic and financial nation in the world. Reduced government spending facilitates greater private sector ingenuity and dynamism, thereby improving living standards for the American people. I look forward to participating in this important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faulkner. Dr. McDowell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, distinguished members of the committee, it is my honor to be speaking with you today about preserving the U.S. dollar's status as the world's preeminent international currency. I would like to open with my bottom line up front. As the United States has increased its reliance on financial sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, it has provoked anti-dollar policy responses from our adversaries. Though such steps are unlikely to upend the dollar's position as top international currency, including the reserve currency role, over time, such policies could diminish the coercive capabilities that the United States derives from dollar centrality. Though our republic has never been ruled by a monarch, the U.S. dollar has become a powerful symbol of American financial royalty. Indeed, the dollar is often described as the king of all currencies, and rightly so. Across the full spectrum of international roles that a national currency can play, the reserve currency role, cross-border payments and trade settlement, turnover in foreign exchange markets, and so on, America's currency outcompetes all comers and presently lacks a true rival in this space. Dollar preeminence and U.S. financial centrality are not without consequence for American coercive power, as you all know. With little more than the stroke of the president's pen or through an act of Congress, the U.S. government can use financial sanctions to impose enormous economic costs on targeted foreign actors, be they individuals, firms, or state institutions, by freezing their dollar assets or cutting them off from access to the banks through which those dollars flow. The consequences for individual targets, known as specially designated nationals or SDNs, are severe, significantly impairing a target's capacity to participate in international trade, investment, debt repayment, and depriving them of access to their wealth. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has used the tool of financial sanctions with increasing frequency. For example, in the year 2000, just 4 foreign governments were directly targeted under a U.S. Treasury country program overseen by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Today, that number is greater than 20, and if we include penalties from secondary sanctions, the list gets even longer. The more that the United States has reached for financial sanctions, the more it has made adversaries in foreign capitals aware of the strategic vulnerability that stems from dependence on the dollar. Some governments have responded by implementing anti-dollar policies, measures that are designed to reduce an economy's reliance on the U.S. currency for investment in cross-border transactions. Though these measures sometimes fail to achieve their goals, others have produced modest levels of de-dollarization. Notable examples here include Russian steps to cut its dollar reserves and reduce the use of the dollar in trade settlement in the years leading up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or China's ongoing efforts to build its own international payments network based on the yuan, efforts that have taken on a new sense of urgency as Beijing has become more aware of its own strategic vulnerabilities from dollar dependence. To be clear, I do not believe that geopolitically motivated moves by Russia, China, or any other country gravely threaten the dollar's supremacy in the near or medium term. The dollar remains the world economy's indispensable currency and maintains economic and political advantages over all alternatives. However, the growing number of states espousing anti-dollar viewpoints and adopting anti-dollar policies does threaten to weaken the future potency of U.S. financial sanctions. I will conclude my remarks with 3 suggestions for U.S. sanctions policy moving forward, aimed at protecting the dollar's global status and preserving the tool's effectiveness for moments when U.S. interests are most gravely threatened. First, the United States should reconsider the use of so-called symbolic financial sanctions. That is, if the main objective of a tranche of sanctions is to signal to the world or to a domestic audience that Washington disapproves of a foreign government's policy choices, other measures that can send a similar signal but do not politicize the dollar system ought to be considered first. Second, the use of financial sanctions against issuers of potential rival currencies, in particular China and its yuan, should face a higher bar of scrutiny. Even a small targeted sanctions program provides information to our adversaries about their vulnerabilities and gives them time to prepare for a future event when a broad U.S. sanctions program may be called upon as part of a major security crisis, when such measures will be most needed. Finally, whenever possible, U.S. financial sanctions should be coordinated with our allies in Europe and Asia, who should feel as if they are key stakeholders in the dollar system and not vassals to it. Such coordinated efforts will prevent our friends from seeking to conduct business with U.S. adversaries outside of the dollar system, and send a message to the whole world that moving activities into secondary currencies like the euro or the yen is not a safe haven. It is my privilege to be here with you today and speak on this critically important issue. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McDowell. Mr. Billingsley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's great to be back with this committee, this time in a personal capacity. The last time I was here was as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes during the Trump administration, where we talked about a wide range of sanctions programs that we were imposing. I'll say at the outset that I agree with you and others that, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the dollar's demise have been greatly exaggerated. That said, we need to remind ourselves that in the 16th century, the Spanish silver dollar was the dominant currency. In the 17th century, it was Dutch florins. In the 18th century, it was the pound sterling. The link between a nation's currency and its role as the relatively dominant political actor on the world stage is pretty clear. And that is why people like Lula from Brazil, Putin, and Xi all aspire to undercut the role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. In my view, Chairman Xi poses the most serious threat to this effort. He has dictatorial control of communist China. He's purged all of his main rivals. He has a vision of China as the middle kingdom to which all of the nations on the periphery ultimately will pay tribute. And some cultures, like the Uyghurs, will be enslaved and eradicated. And to that end, he's overseen a massive expansion in Chinese conventional military capability, an unprecedented nuclear weapons buildup, and he is now ominously threatening invasion of Taiwan. It should therefore come as no surprise that he, via the People's Bank of China, would like to undercut both the dollar and sanctions-proof the Chinese economy as they plan for that invasion of Taiwan. If we look at what Russia did in the run-up to its further invasion of Ukraine, they began dumping ownership of treasury bonds in 2018. In that year, they plummeted from $96 billion in holdings down to $15 billion, and they also started buying large amounts of gold. China is now, as the ranking member has observed, embarking on its own gold buying spree. I haven't seen the data for May, but April marked the 6th straight month of Chinese expansion in its gold holdings. And I'm not sure I believe the official figures. We have to recall that China is the dominant gold mining player around the world, and half of those gold mining companies are state-owned. So the actual size of China's war chest when it comes to gold reserves may be far higher. In fact, I suspect inevitably far higher than official numbers suggest. Last year, China also started dumping its treasuries. 2022 marked the largest or second largest decrease on record, with a drop of about $174 billion, and China stood at the lowest level since 2010 in terms of its holdings, though this past March they did reverse course. This bears close watching because a sell-off may be a strong indicator of planned aggression. But I think the area where we really need to focus, and where I would agree with you, Chairman, I'm not sure the Treasury has a plan, is how do we deal with the fact that the sheer size of the Chinese economy dwarfs what we've been contending with in the form of Iran, Russia, and so on. And one of the first things the Biden administration did in the wake of Russia's attack was start sanctioning Russian banks and de-SWIFTing them. And that's one thing when you're going after an economy smaller than the size of Texas. It's quite another when you consider that out of the 100 largest banks in the world, China has 20, and all 4 of the top 4 are Chinese banks. And that is why many within the Treasury contended when I was there, and they will contend to this day, that these Chinese banks are simply too big to sanction. I don't agree that we can allow that to stand, but I do believe we have to start taking very swift action to put us in a situation where we could take punitive measures on these banks if necessary. And to that end, it is good that the market is beginning to respond to Chinese bellicose rhetoric. We've seen the Chinese stock market or the capitalization of Chinese companies come way down. We've also seen a drop in most of the major indexes. We've also seen the 3 biggest banks in the United States start to trim their exposure, but I believe we need to encourage further reduction. And to that end, one of the things we should do is increase the capital requirements on banks that have substantial exposure. We need to ensure that our largest banks can withstand the systemic shocks that would arise from a tit-for-tat with China. We also need to recognize, as the Atlantic Council has pointed out, that China holds over $5 billion in various liabilities to Western investors that they could hold hostage in the event of a sanctions war. And we need to begin educating our pension funds and our investment funds on the substantial risk that they run by leaving those assets in China. Again, I appreciate the chance to testify before this committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Billingsley. Professor Norloff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Dear committee members, thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, for inviting me to testify on this important topic. I am honored. I will speak to 3 themes: the dollar's dominance, threats to dollar dominance, what the U.S. should do to maintain dominance. And my written statement provides further explanation and context. The dollar is the most important currency in the world, both for official and private actors, although its dominance has been declining since the 1970s, and there has been a recent downward cycle since 2016. Now, dominance can simply mean relatively stronger than anyone else, but here I take dominance to mean a currency that other currency majors are unable to balance, effectively a unipolar currency order. I will note that the dollar's dominance is not quite as strong amongst private actors and private markets as it is with the governments. In private transactions, it averages about 45% of the world total. That includes FX transactions, but also things like issuance of international debt securities and cross-border banking. On threats to dollar dominance, the Russia sanctions have had little impact, to no impact actually, on dollar dominance. In fact, given the recent uptick in the dollar's reserve currency status, sanctions may be reinforcing dollar dominance. The Chinese yuan poses no immediate threat to dollar dominance. It accounts for roughly 3% of overall reserves. And so far, China has been successful in promoting the yuan with its trade partners, but the yuan is scarcely used by countries outside trade with China. China is a potential long-term challenger due to its active pursuit of trade and investment relationships. If the yuan is increasingly used by third countries, it will pose a greater threat to the dollar. And in addition to these external threats, there is also a domestic threat. Flirting with the possibility of a voluntary default puts dollar dominance at risk. What should the U.S. do to maintain dominance? To curb the domestic threat, Congress should consider creating an alternative mechanism for resolving political differences on government spending and its consequences. To rein in external threats, the United States should, whenever possible, implement multilateral sanctions in support of broadly endorsed goals to shore up the liberal international order. This is likely to limit dollar backlash. To counter China's advances, the U.S. should consider economic inducements in addition to its use of sanctions as a tool of economic statecraft. The United States cannot afford to alienate security allies in this geopolitical environment. Security relationships are increasingly informing economic relationships. Just as countries are starting to source goods from friendly nations, they may adopt friendly nation currencies as they did during the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and thank each of you for testimony this morning. Very impressive, very impressive. And so with that, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes as we begin the questioning portion of our hearing. You know, the conversation around the dollar being a reserve currency is becoming louder and louder as we have more and more, I think, threats to it. I think I agree with all of you that there's not an immediate threat within the next few years, but as a businessman, I usually look at not only short-term problems, but I look at long-term problems. And I look from 30,000 feet. And from 30,000 feet and from long-term, I see the threat that each of you have discussed this morning with regards to China. They are trading now in their own currency with their friends and allies. As that sphere of influence gets bigger, it chips away at our reserve currency. I think one of you gave some statistics on it. So I would like to talk a little bit about how we're forcing them into this position from the standpoint that I think each of you made the comment. I think Dr. McDowell made a comment with regards to the history of the currency. We're looking at a currency that is being challenged now because we're putting sanctions on China, and they are looking at other ways to get around it. As long as our friends are our friends, they're okay with our dollar. When the enemies are getting pushed into a corner, they look for ways to get out of it, and our dollar is a way to control people, and they don't want to be under our control. So therefore, looking at ways to get around it. Mr. Billingsley, would you comment on that? They seem to be decoupling themselves from our own, trying to establish their own currency. Where do you see this going in the next, say, 20 years?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I think that their desire to establish their national currency as a true international currency fits hand in glove with their vision of themselves as the dominant player on the world stage, or at least that's what they would like to become. I agree with you that for the time being, I don't see that actually they're going to have all that much success in establishing the yuan as a hard currency globally for basically two reasons. One, China's a currency manipulator, and so people who hold the yuan are also holding a lot of risk that it may not have the same value tomorrow that it has today. And two, they have a very restrictive capital outflow regime that basically prevents you from moving currencies out of the country. They're very closed in that respect, and those are going to be their two main impediments. The thing I do worry, and I come back to this fact that they've been buying a lot of gold, is that one of the things that they could do, which would be very concerning if they wind up having larger reserves of gold than we believe, is they could start issuing yuan or gold-denominated, gold-backed yuan contracts. And that would further their ambition for introducing the yuan onto the world stage. But at the moment, the yuan is not a widely held reserve currency. In fact, a third of all yuan reserves are sitting in Russia today. Thank you, Chairman.
Believing or suggesting perhaps that they go into Taiwan, how would this affect our reserve currency status with them, basically the world being in a lockdown position for a period of time until that situation is resolved? Because they'll invade, we'll sanction, and then off we go. And so I think a couple of you talked about the sanctions being something we have to work very carefully about how we manipulate that. It can be counterproductive. Would somebody like to comment on that?
Yeah, Chairman Luke DeMar, thank you for a great question. My own view on China here is that their short-term efforts are focused primarily on increasing their resilience and autonomy in the event of a future sanctionings package from the United States, perhaps as a result of a conflict with Taiwan. Their focus, I think, is on trade settlement and cross-border payments. That's where I think we're seeing most of the developments. Right now, around 20% of China's cross-border trade is settled in its own currency. That's up over the last few years after reaching 30% prior to 2015. The reason they're focused on that is I think the strength of our sanctions are actually more on stopping firms, individuals, and government institutions from participating in cross-border trade and payments, more so than even freezing assets, which is sort of a one-time, one-off sanctions, whereas cutting actors off from banks means your ability to participate in cross-border trade, debt repayment, et cetera, strained for so long as those sanctions are in place. And so the Chinese have been interested, I think, in improving the use of the yuan through networks like the cross-border interbank payment system, SIPs, piloting ECNY, other things like that, that will eliminate their reliance 100% on using the dollar and the dollar system.
Fascinating. I would like to really follow up with regards to your gold comment, Mr. Billington, because it looks to me like at some point there may be a shift to the gold standard again. If that's happening, if they're going to push us in that direction, it would be interesting to see once to at least play a what-if game of what could happen there. My time is up, and with that, I'll recognize the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, to the witnesses, let me echo what the chairman and I were talking about. Certainly your presentations, all of you were not only quite impressive and scholarly, but probably one of the best panels that I've had to witness on this topic. So again, thank you for that. And not to mention, Mr. Chairman, let the record show that they did quote me several times. With that, let me move to the first question. To Dr. Norloff, I'd like to start with other countries' efforts to replace or bypass the U.S. dollar. We've heard from all of you a lot about China and Russia's increasing their gold reserves, the use of alternative payment systems, and certainly certain African nations also partnering up to develop a multilateral system that evades the dollars. Can you tell me if there is any one thing that stands out to you that you can share with us about efforts led by China and Russia and other nations to circumvent the U.S. dollar and the U.S.-led financial system? And then, Mr. Billingsley, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yes, I think that those efforts are a new development, but I think that they are not very consequential because they build on the idea that local currencies will be used, the bilateral currencies, and these relationships will be used. And in order to internationalize a currency, you really need to use a third-party currency. So outside that relationship. And that is not happening on any scale that is significant whatsoever. And so therefore I see those efforts as very limited. Now, as has been pointed out by the entire panel here, I think that there is something to still track in that these alternative payment systems allow for a relative insulation of the dollar system. And so as we move forward, it's important to look at where those investment and trade relationships are going.
Okay, thank you. Only because my time is, Mr. Billingsley.
Thank you, Chair, Congresswoman. I would offer two thoughts in this respect. The first is that China considers the actual composition of its foreign exchange reserves to be a state secret. So they don't publish, and they view it as a criminal offense to try to obtain that information in terms of the balance of how much is gold, how much are dollar or euro denominated. But the numbers I've seen suggest that still at this moment, they're about 50 to 60% of their Forex reserves are still in dollars or euros, which means that they are at high risk of sanctions. We can affect them. The problem is that war chest that they've built up is enormous. It's more than $3 trillion that they have in Forex reserves. Compare that with what Russia had at the onset of its assault, which was around 680 billion, of which we managed to freeze overseas half of it. But Russia is still keeping its economy going despite the Biden administration's sanctions. So imagine how they're going to be able to continue with that sizable war kitty in Beijing if they do decide to go after the Taiwanese. Final point on gold. The reason why regimes that come under sanctions like gold is because it's hard to trace. It's fairly anonymous. The only problem with it is it's really, really heavy.
Thank you very much. Let me just skip to another question, and I'm really asking you this because I want it to be on the record. We spent a lot of time after our debt ceiling vote on getting educated. We know we will revisit this in 2 years, January 2025. So let me ask all of you, and it's a yes or no. I'll go down the line and ask you to comment yes or no on the effect of the debt default on the strength of the U.S. dollars. Is it yes or no for you that the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency would be harmed by default on Americans' debt? And we'll start it at this end. Mr. Goodspeed, is yes or no?
If the U.S. defaulted on its debt, it would harm the U.S. dollar status.
Okay, Mr. Faulkner?
I agree, yes.
Okay, McDowell?
I agree.
Mr. Billings?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Mrs. Norloff?
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I don't know if I have time for the next question. I'll read it and you can respond in writing. We know that non-U.S. mobile payment applications reportedly have reached more than 1 billion consumers and processed over more than $6 million worth of transaction. So I believe the continued advancement of these products into foreign markets can diminish the U.S. competitiveness and yield opportunities for foreign governments to influence international payment. So the question to you will be, what do you think about that? And we'll take that in writing. My time is up.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and for the witnesses' impressive testimony. This is probably the most important hearing we've held this entire Congress, and the testimony is excellent. Let me ask Dr. Goodspeed and Dr. Falconer about the relative risks to the dollar's dominance. We have these internal risks, regulatory failure that diminished the dynamism of the U.S. Free enterprise system. We have maybe bad tax policy. We have unsustainable debt trajectory. Those are internal threats. Then we have these exogenous external threats, BRICS, a Saudi oil deal with China denominated in the yuan, the SIPS system, which is an alternative to SWIFT, the advent of crypto, adoption of a Chinese CBDC. Compare the risks, and which is the more significant risk in your mind?
So economists like to talk about the short term versus the long run, and I think that's applicable here. Short term, I think the risk is that we continue to see diversification away from the dollar, PRC continuing to push other countries to use trade invoicing in renminbi, that they continue to promote the offshore renminbi market, that they continue to promote or force bilateral clearing. Longer term, I think the bigger risk is that foreign investors no longer perceive the United States federal government debt to be as safe and risk-free as it is today perceived.
I tend to agree. I would say that in the short run, as you see more trading take place in other currencies, just for facilitating transactions, you'll see reserve banks around the world increasing their holdings of other of assets denominated in things other than dollars. But for purposes of holding long-term reserves, ultimately it's a claim on the underlying country. And for reasons that have been spoken to, I don't trust claims against the Chinese economy when it comes to commodity-backed currencies. One is always concerned about whether they would suspend convertibility in times of crisis and whether those asset-backed currencies actually will be backed by those assets when the time comes. And instead, you're still going to be a claim against the underlying economy, which is why growth along with fiscal stewardship are essential to maintaining our status as what you would hold for long-term reserve assets.
It sounds like preserving the dollar's dominance, maintaining that is both offensive and defensive. We need to be defensive when it comes to keeping our house in order, getting our house in order here at home, but also recognizing some offensive threats outside of the United States. Mr. Billingsley and also Dr. McDowell, I wanted to ask you all about this idea of sanctions. And we do have, as Mr. Billingsley is advocating for, a legislative proposal that would implement some investment screening, Western investment screening. It would use the architecture of OFAC to sanction Chinese entities that threaten our national security, to give a clear red light to Western investors to not invest in these Chinese technology, defense, military, surveillance companies that threaten our national security on exchanges, A-shares outside of the United States as well. But I wanted Dr. McDowell to speak about this idea of symbolic sanctions and politicizing the dollar. Is there a risk with that kind of approach that we would be doing what you advise against?
It sounds like what you're describing is more of an investment restriction, using sort of access to information through OFAC to prohibit or advise against investment. That's different, I think, from cutting off the firms from using dollar payments. And so I think the risk is lower based on what you've just described.
Right, and Mr. Billingsley, are there alternatives to a central bank digital currency that would help maintain the dollar's dominance as China pursues a CBDC? In other words, would a stablecoin regulatory framework that would encourage stable coins denominated in the dollar, would that be a better alternative than the United States adopting our own CBDC? What I always say is we shouldn't counter China by becoming more like China. Well, you know, the Chinese CBDC is a surveillance tool. And I think we all need to just understand that they've been kind of very open about the fact that they intend to track holdings of this. I also have some doubts that if we can't even get a website for healthcare functioning, I'm not exactly sure that we can build a digital dollar in any meaningful time frame under the Federal Reserve. There is a stable coin already out there that is denominated in dollars, and for every dollar they issue, they do hold in reserve.
I yield. Thank you.
Gentleman's time is up. That would go to the gentleman from North Carolina. Mr. Nichols, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. One potential threat to the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency is the growth and expansion of alternative cross-border payment systems, such as those developed by Russia and China. Increased use of these systems could lead to a world less dependent on U.S. dollars, which would likely limit our traditional methods of economic sanctions. Dr. Norloof, to you, how should U.S. national security experts be preparing to respond to this scenario?
Thank you. So I think that this is a long-term threat, and it really requires for the countries that are pushing alternative payment systems to build economic relationships, to build commercial relationships, and to start trading in the yuan outside of established bilateral relationships. And so I think that the best way that the United States can counter this is to start building, reinforcing its economic relationships. So expanding trade, expanding investment.
Thank you. Sanctions that are made possible by the strength of the U.S. dollar could push countries to reduce their use of U.S. dollars and minimize the global economic power of the U.S. Governments could experiment with other national currencies to proactively shield their economies from the U.S. Dr. Norloof, again to you, what inflection points would signal that major economies are making serious attempts to de-dollarize?
So I think that we are nowhere close to an inflection point in the reserve currency function. There's actually more movement on the private dimension. And there were some numbers quoted here before. I think that in FX transactions, for instance, the dollar is not as dominant as has been made out. It accounts for about 45% of FX transactions, because the 90% figure is out of 200%. Because currencies exist on both sides of an exchange. And so we see that across the board in financial markets, that the US dollar is in fact less dominant than it is with official holders.
And just to sum up here, how should policymakers like us, how should we be responding to the scenario I laid out?
So I think, again, that key here really is to reinforce existing relationships, economic relationships that the United States has, and expand them where they do not exist. This is the best way for the United States to undercut the developments that are now underway.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That would go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, who's the chairman of the Small Business Committee. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. The U.S. dollar has held a leading position in the global economy as a primary reserve currency since World War II. We've talked about that. And this status has given the United States economic and political advantages to strengthen market security and boost our monetary independence. Now there are the concerns that the rise of China's yuan and the euro and the other currencies are threatening to replace the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Now this decision would have, we all know, severe economic consequences. We've talked about that. However, despite challenges to the role of the U.S. dollar, other countries' currencies lack the scale and ability to serve as the workable alternative. So even still, we must continue to examine risks that threaten the dollar's global role in reserve currency. Dr. Goodspeed, could you elaborate some more on the dangers of replacing the dollar as the global reserve currency, and what makes the dollar the safest compared to the alternatives, and how we can better promote, be retail, about the global confidence in the dollar?
Sure. I've heard it said by the president, don't compare me to the almighty, but compare me to the alternative. And I think something similar can be said of the US dollar, that this is, as members of the panel have said, the deepest, most liquid market for safe assets in the world. And if you're going to hold a currency, you want to be able to park that currency in a safe, liquid asset that you can easily dispose of if you want to convert it. And that is not in the renminbi for the reasons that have been cited, in particular the capital controls, so they are working to get around that by having offshore markets. It is not in the euro because they lack a liquid market for a single homogeneous debt. It is the US dollar, and we benefit from that for the reasons I cited economically and for reasons that other members of the witness panel have cited in terms of national security.
Thank you. In recent years, China has conducted a series of strategic initiatives aimed at challenging the dominance of the U.S. dollar. And one specific strategy has been currency manipulation. The Chinese have been manipulating their currency to gain unfair advantages in international trade, and Communist China is creating an unlevel playing field by imposing capital controls and limiting the currency flowing in and out of China. So this negatively impacts countries with market-driven exchange rate systems by creating doubts about the convertibility of the yuan. So we must put an end to this manipulative practice and protect U.S. interests by holding China accountable. So, Mr. Billingsley, what actions are the CCP taking to undermine the global role of the U.S. dollar, and how can we hold them accountable for their manipulation of currencies while maintaining our dominance?
Well, I think it's important that that the Treasury resume calling it for what it is, which is a currency manipulator. We did that under the Trump administration.
Mr. Billingsley, can you pull your microphone closer to you, please?
We did that under the Trump administration. I also would point out that we run a trade deficit with the Chinese. And what that means is, as they export more to us than they import from us, all of that delta between what we buy and versus what they buy goes into that war chest that they're building up. That's their Forex reserves. Under the Biden administration, the amount of that bilateral trade and the deficit has surged yet again from what it was when he took over in 2020. So we do need to look at how we become much more competitive and insist on a more equitable balance of trade.
Okay. My last question, during the past economic crisis like the financial crisis of 2008 and 2020 COVID pandemic, the dollar has remained strong on the world stage. However, there is a concern that with the rapid rise of inflation our nation is currently facing is not only hurting us at home, but is also hurting our reputation abroad. And the Biden administration has fueled the economic downturn our country is facing, and many Americans are struggling to keep up with increasing costs for groceries, gas, and housing. And on top of all that, small businesses, of which I'm one, are crippled by high inflation and rising interest rates. Despite warnings, this administration continues their reckless spending spree that has brought on the highest inflation in decades. And Dr. Faulkner, quickly, can you expand on how record high inflation is affecting the U.S. dollar globally? How can the government boost dollar assets to protect our financial markets and make us more attractive?
Absolutely. As you said, during the onset of the pandemic, it was necessary to engage in significant spending to support American households. But since then, the ongoing spending, well in excess of historical levels, has meant that there are way too many dollars chasing too few goods and services, and American families and small businesses have struggled the most. The issue that we've also got is that we've called upon foreign countries largely through the budget deficits we run to hold those dollar-denominated assets as part of their reserves, and what that does is contribute to the very trade deficit we're talking about. So to the extent that we wanted not to facilitate China's buildup of a war chest, running something closer to a balanced budget that does not necessitate foreign countries buying our debt would be beneficial.
Okay. Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. This is a very important conversation, and it has been on all of our minds after going through the debt ceiling debate and what might happen if we were unable to come to an agreement. This is my first year in Congress, but watching this over a long time and the hostage taking that unfortunately has taken place every time this comes up is deeply concerning. And it's even more concerning having gone through it here in this body. When I think about the long-term impacts, the message that this sends globally, when people have to question whether or not investing in the United States is viable, whether or not the United States of America will pay its bills. That is a huge security risk, and it is, we made it pass this time, even though I think that the tactics used were deeply disappointing. But I'm very concerned about this in the long term. And when I think about some of my colleagues who oftentimes talk about the threat to China, inadvertently, this is okay, China would want nothing more than what we've gone through and what the potential consequences are. It would reduce the value in the dollar, the security of the United States, and our reputation and our long-term investments here in this country. So do you think that it is in our best interest for our national security, the strength of our dollar, to address the debt ceiling and take that off the table for the United States?
Was the question directed to me? No.
Anyone who would like
Anyway,
to answer.
I will answer. I think that there should be some alternative mechanism for discussing government spending and its consequences. I think that it is very detrimental to the United States' credibility and to the dollar status in the world. I also want to underline that any default that occurs on the part of the United States is entirely voluntary. There can be no forced sovereign default in the case of the United States.
Congresswoman, the dilemma is that once you issue the debt, you need to honor it. And so defaulting on that, it would do grave harm. But the problem is that at a certain point, if you keep issuing debt and debt and debt, and you have runaway spending, that also winds up biting you because it begins to call into question whether or not we actually can be trusted to honor that debt. So there's a balance here, but it's clear that the profligate spending really does have to come to an end.
Absolutely, and I think that everyone here in Congress is concerned about the debt that the United States has and has different approaches on what we need to do to deal with that. But that should be a legislative process and much more long-term planning and than the hostage-taking that we've seen. Something that you brought up, Mr. McDowell, was around the symbolic financial sanctions that have been used if we don't agree with a country politically. And one that immediately comes to mind that has impacted my community, that's still on the books, is the sanctions on Canada for lumber that have increased costs for housing and actually addressing the needs there. So something that you've talked about, I don't know if you have any other examples on what that looks like, but making sure that we use these very strategically and that we should consider other measures to send signals to countries so it's not compromising our dollar. Can you give examples of what those measures look like, recognizing, of course, that utilizing these economic tools are important for ensuring peace, but making sure that they're very limited?
Yes, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. So time is short, so I'll be brief. When I talk about symbolic sanctions, again, I'm talking about sanctions specifically using the financial system and access to the dollar. So other forms of sanctions are sort of not part of the discussion that I provided today. An example I would use would be sanctions that were used to target Carrie Lam and other officials in Hong Kong in 2020. I was as upset as anyone about what was happening there. But in that case, it's very unlikely they're going to change Xi Jinping's behavior and plan for Hong Kong. And the effect is it raised alarm bells in Beijing about the United States' willingness to use sanctions against China, and I think has sort of precipitated further steps from the Chinese to, again, build up the resilience to a future event where we may need sanctions in a moment where our security is critically at risk.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Muser is recognized for 5
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. We are having a serious discussion on the economy, as we should be, because we have some serious issues. The present administration policies are weakening our economy through excessive spending and the value of the dollar, which causes inflation. Energy policies that are causing energy to spike and maintain a level of stagflation, perhaps. A Fed reaction that was first overdoing it with stimulus and of course, followed by the most rapid increase in interest rates we've ever seen. And of course, the threat of taxes on American businesses, which is pretty much the worst thing he could do and gives nothing but an advantage to China. Meanwhile, China is strengthening. It's got R&D incentives, more engineers, strategic alliances, low-cost production. It's got workforce availability. So we need to get into shape. We're getting ourselves out of shape, and we need to be serious about being the strongest economy in the world. So, Mr. Billingsley, I'd like to just start with you. What do you think reversing some course here, where we rein in spending, i.e. curbing inflation, create some predictability to future taxes, and have a energy independent program? You think those would be steps in the right direction?
I do. It would certainly help my investment portfolio. But more to the geostrategic point here, because of what the Biden administration has done on energy, we are seeing that our efforts to go after Putin are not being successful because we've been unwilling to actually sanction his oil exports. The Biden administration has actually issued a license that explicitly permits all of those sanctioned banks. It's still fine to transact with them as long as it's related to energy exports, because they don't want to see the price of the pump go up, but they're not willing to allow the exploration and production necessary to bring the price of the pump down through American energy.
Sure, at a huge cost to the typical American family and business.
And to the Ukrainian people who are suffering from the fact that that war machine in Russia keeps going.
Agreed. Agreed. I have a bill, the China Exchange Rate Transparency Act, calls for the U.S. to advocate for the IMF for more transparency with respect to Chinese exchange rate policies. Is this level of transparency, you think this is something that would make an impact, would be a difference? And are we doing enough to maintain, keep China from following the rules all other IMF nations are following? Mr. Billingsley?
I'd defer to my colleagues, sir. I actually haven't had a chance to read your bill, but I'd be happy to take a look at it.
All right, please. Mr. Falconer, appreciate it.
I would reiterate something that was said earlier, which is that the Biden administration should yet again label China as a currency manipulator and once again take steps to mitigate some of those impacts. Some of the things that we did during the Trump administration in our trade negotiations were to punish them exactly for not only the intellectual property theft and the forced technology transfers, but also their currency manipulation. And I think we need to take a much harder line on reining in some of the manipulation they're doing. I don't know whether the IMF is the best way to do it versus doing it through bilateral activities and multilateral sanctions, but certainly there needs to be at least a relabeling them as a currency manipulator.
It's one of many actions that probably need to be taken. Mr. Falconer, my colleague French Hill introduced the 21st Century Dollar Act. Could you speak to how requiring the Treasury to develop a real strategy to strengthen the dollar would help set a clear path for Congress moving forward?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Treasury Secretary more than anyone has responsibility for ensuring the dollar maintains its status as the world's reserve currency. And so Treasury should be at the forefront of the intersection of the three things that Congressman Hill's bill speaks to, which is upgrades to the payment system, fiscal responsibility, and appropriate use of sanctions. And so there's not only, I think that the Treasury needs to take a much greater role as the steward of American debt to help guide us towards a path towards fiscal responsibility, but we also need to make sure that we create a regulatory sandbox where financial innovation and technology investments can take place that find the balance between speeding payment implementation with the national security anti-money laundering statutes that we have.
Okay, as well, got limited time here. Mr. Billingsley, you mentioned how the dollar is not under short-term threat, but is under long-term threat. So as a follow-up to this hearing, maybe you could send me something on what you think should be done. Congress can do more so over the longer term. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Then we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Foster, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Now, many of the witnesses here have emphasized the advantages that the American consumer gets from having a strong U.S. dollar. And so now, over the last 40 years, without exception, the U.S. dollar has strengthened under Democratic administrations and weakened under Republican administrations. This is the data here, which, it's a pretty impressive plot. And I'll just read you the actual numbers. The United States dollar weakened by 2.2% under President Reagan, another 1% under President Bush. It then strengthened by 18% under President Clinton and weakened by 24% under President George W. Bush. It then strengthened by 13% under President Obama, weakened by 10% under President Trump, and now it's the last time I made this plot was it had been up about 12% under President Biden. So this is a pretty impressive correlation. So I was wondering what the witnesses' thoughts are on what's driving that. Is it simply the fact that the international community has a lot more confidence in the U.S. economy when Democrats are running it? Is there a pattern that we see here of Republicans getting the keys to the car, sending it into the ditch, and then Democrats have to go dig it out and get it moving again? So what are the things that are responsible for that really impressive correlation? Any thoughts on it? We'll just go left to right if you want.
I think that there are many factors that influence foreign exchange rate movements that don't boil down to political cyclical factors, but rather asynchronous monetary policy tightening. In recent years, in 2018, 2019, the Federal Reserve was engaged in quantitative tightening and were raising interest rates while Europe, Japan, the United Kingdom were continuing quantitative easing and low interest
So your
rates.
view is just an accident that without exception, it's always strengthened under Democrats?
It's also a function of budget deficits. So typically, if we are having to borrow more, that means yields on government debt here are going to be higher. That's going to
All right, so Republican tax cuts, for example, would be one of the things that would weaken the dollar. Or actually,
insofar as they contributed to larger deficits, that would actually increase the dollar.
Okay.
Because deficits tend to.
If we can go down the line, any other thoughts on what the reason for this might be?
I've not yet studied the data. I'd happy for questions for the record to look into the timing of when it took place and try to factor out which were the policy decisions versus what were the other factors. But I'd be hesitant to speak to 6 data points and try to claim on the fly a causation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so if you can all follow up for the record on that. I think it's a pretty powerful correlation, and we have to understand it. And also, as someone who started a manufacturing business that exports a good fraction of what we manufacture, this is a double-edged sword. When people complain about currency manipulation, which is artificially depressing the value of your currency, then so it's not a clean win. And some business sectors win and some lose when you have a strong or a weak dollar. But it's still, my feeling is as much as anything, it's a statement about the confidence that the rest of the world has in the way Democratic administrations take their responsibilities seriously. Now, Dr. Goodspeed, thank you for your service on the Council of Economic Advisors and the last president. But last month, your former boss, President Trump, urged Republicans to do a default as part of their budget negotiating tactics. Is this a policy that the Trump White House Council of Economic Advisors considered or endorsed during the times of Republican control?
If I recall from the town hall, I don't think he urged them to default. And to answer your question, no, it was not something we considered or recommended in the Council of Economic Advisors.
Okay. Now, also, let's say previously President Trump has suggested that the entire national debt could simply be retired by a one-time wealth assessment on multimillionaires and billionaires. So first off, is this even feasible in the sense that is there enough money in the top fraction of a percent to completely retire the national debt?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, some of you have these numbers. I think it's pretty clear there is. You may or may not be a good idea, but there is, roughly roughly, the majority of wealth is held by people with net worth over $10 million, which is roughly the top 10%, I believe.
I mean, if you look at the paper wealth, the wealth on paper of the U.S. economy, I mean, what? The
Household
market
net worth,
capitalization is something about $80 trillion, which, as you said, is in excess of $30 trillion. But understand that operationally, you would then have to liquidate simultaneously $30 trillion worth of financial assets. And when you did so, the market impact is going to crush the economy, and you would not have.
Sir, yeah, I don't think it's a serious
in practice,
short-term.
no, it's not feasible to do.
Right, but it would be something you would do over time. Thanks, you'll back. Look forward to your responses for the record on the.
Gentleman's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Loudermilk is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and sharing your time and knowledge with us. Mr. Billingsley, in your response to Chairman Luetkemeier's question earlier in the hearing, you expressed concern with the convertible gold-backed Chinese yuan. And I wanted to follow up and ask if you would elaborate further on how a gold-backed yuan would possess more credible threat to the dollar than the BRICS common currency.
Thank you, sir. Basically, what I mean by that, and they have not done that, but the world wants relatively safe, stable investments, and that's what the dollar represents, but that's also what gold represents. The yuan does not currently represent that.
Okay, thank you for that. What about the risk of long-term bilateral trade agreements between China and emerging countries? Does the idea that China would use multilateral international agreements like BRICS common currency conflict with what we know about their preference for deliberate piecemeal strategies?
Would you like me to respond to that?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Sure. Look, the BRICS are, these are countries, India being an exception in that, but these are countries that are autocratic or otherwise have, very hostile opinions of the United States, especially Russia and China. So I think we need to understand that they are working at cross purposes with us on the full range of issues. Where we need to be very, very careful and where I think we've perhaps taken a major step backwards is allowing China to insert itself into the Persian Gulf and what they're doing with the Saudis in particular. They want guaranteed access to Saudi oil in the event of a crisis, and that's what they're up to in brokering those relationships.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that China would want significant control over common currencies, and we have to be very vigilant. Another question, Mr. Billingsley, how have BRICS and BRICS-aligned countries responded to the de-swifting of Russia following the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
They don't like it because they can see it being done to their banks in a crisis, but they don't currently have much of an alternative. And because of the dominant role that the dollar plays, whether it's a 200% or 100%, it's still the dominant trading currency. SWIFT is, for the time being, the only game in town.
Okay, appreciate that. What risk would the excessive use of de-swifting as sanctions alternative pose to U.S. dominance in the global financial system? Anybody who would like to answer
Michael
that is fine.
Yeah, so I think again the demonstration of U.S. control over the actual flow of dollars, of communication, absolutely provides information to adversaries to prepare for events where they may face similar circumstances. And so I think what we're seeing is, China, we're seeing Russia, we're seeing other countries try to create alternative, certainly payments networks. Russia has its own SPFS payment messaging system. It's quite small. It was launched in 2014, not coincidentally, after the initial round of sanctions targeting Russia. In terms of SIPs, China's cross-border payments network, Belarus announced it was having banks join immediately following the 2022 sanctions. And so what I'm saying is there's a pattern, between when the United States mobilizes control over the pipes and the messaging of cross-border payments and adversaries looking for alternatives. Doesn't mean they're using them, but they're getting plugged into the system as at least sort of a rainy day option in the event of a future targeting.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. And while I got you, what standards of scrutiny would you recommend Congress or the President consider before leveling sanctions on a country like China?
I think with China, again, I look at China not just as a typical country, because I think they're an alternative service provider. All right, most countries fall into alternative service users. They're looking for an alternative to the dollar. China, you could perhaps put Europe in this as well. The only two sort of economic blocks capable, I think, of constructing an attractive enough cross-border payments network that could attract those alternative service users that are looking for that network. Right. And so that's why I think, again, with China, there should be a higher bar of scrutiny. That doesn't mean sanctions would never be appropriate against China. We could talk about circumstances where they would be very appropriate. But I think for smaller bites at the apple, it may not be worth the risk, right, of sort of spurring China to move forward and build that alternative network, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from California. Mr. Vargas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for holding this hearing and for the ranking member. I also want to thank the witnesses. I too think that this has been an excellent hearing. Dr. Faulkner, if I may ask you first, you've mentioned the interest rate in the United States. What has been the interest rate in the UK and in the EU? Has it been higher or lower? The inflation rate, excuse me. The inflation rate has been higher or lower than the United States?
So inflation...
Yeah, has it been higher or lower?
Inflation immediately following the pandemic was originally higher in the United States and then ultimately became higher in Europe. But it started here and was higher here first.
So it started higher here, then it was higher in Europe. Is it higher in Europe now, or is it higher here?
It is currently higher in Europe.
So how long has it been higher in Europe?
We peaked at 9% in early 2022. They peaked a little higher than that later than that. So it's been about a year, if I recall correctly.
Well, I think it's been longer than that they've been higher than we have. Yeah, I think you like data. You should go back and look, because I know it's been more than a year. I've been following it for more than a year. It was
right around the Russian invasion of Ukraine in around February, so I guess a year and 4 months.
So it's interesting because you keep blaming the Biden administration tangentially for inflation. You don't mention this is a worldwide inflation problem because of COVID and also because, obviously, the war in Ukraine. You keep saying it's because of the spending in the United States. Well, spending in the United States is not causing inflation in Europe. But anyway, I move on to my next question. The interesting thing, you guys talk also just about cuts and not about, that we're spending too much, but not about money, not about, bringing more money into the system, taxes in particular. What were the taxes under President Eisenhower? What was the highest marginal tax rate? Anybody know?
I believe before the Kennedy tax cuts, the top marginal rate peaked in above 90%, although that was not a rate that anyone really paid.
Yeah, so under Eisenhower, I think it was 91%. And in fact, interestingly, Kennedy ran on lowering taxes. And in fact, he wasn't able to because he was murdered before he was able to do that. So it was Lyndon Johnson that actually brought it down to 78%. But the interesting thing was that they really were worried about the debt. They really did want to pay it back. They didn't want to lay it off on future generations. And they didn't want to lay it off on the poor. So they paid higher taxes. Their effective rate was much higher than it is today. But again, they paid their taxes. You guys just look at cuts. You want the cuts on the poorest of the people, but you're not looking at what the wealthy are paying. And I think that's very important. I do want to ask, though, another question. I'm through with those questions about cryptocurrency. That hasn't been brought up much today. What is the issue with cryptocurrency? Is that a danger to the dollar? Some of us know, obviously, it's very small at the moment, but could that increase to be a real problem? Why don't we start with you, Doctor?
Sure. First of all, I would say that the 2017 tax law was a lesson in terms of lowering marginal rates and broadening the base. And the way we broadened the base was by limiting the state and local tax deduction and the mortgage interest deduction, which are two deductions that massively favor the highest income earners in the United States. In terms of cryptocurrency, as of yet, I don't see cryptocurrency being a safe, liquid asset that would rival other U.S. dollar-denominated assets in terms of reserve currency and international currency appeal.
Dr. Faulkner?
So on taxes, I would just merely mention that
and not taxes, we're on cryptocurrency.
Percentage of GDP that's captured in the form of taxes is the third highest.
I'm going to move on. I'm going to reclaim my time.
Cryptocurrency,
if you're not going to answer the question, I'm going to move on. Thank you.
With cryptocurrency.
No, I'm going to move on for you. Thank you. Cryptocurrency, sir.
Gentlemen, either ask a question or allow your...
I asked
your-
the question, and he
He's
answered a
answering your
different question.
Gentlemen. Either reclaim your time and go to another witness and ask a question.
My time is continuing to run here, and so
Well,
I'm
you're
going to ask...
continuing to talk about it. You're recognized for the balance of your time to ask a question of the witnesses.
He was answering on a question I've already asked.
And you reclaimed your time and went back to go to another witness.
You know, in fact, my time is almost over now since the
I'll give you
conversation
another 30
we've had.
seconds.
No, that's okay. But I asked the question. They answered the question, and I didn't want them to go back to the question.
Reclaim
The
your
question
time
was,
and go
no,
to the next witness.
you go ahead, but I'm going to yield back my time. I asked my questions. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luckmeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, for holding this hearing. You know, it's no secret that CCP, under authoritarian regime of President Xi Jinping, is working to displace the United States as the top economy in the world, encountered the American dream with the CCP's version of the China dream at the global stage. The CCP is strategically undermining U.S. interests at every turn, as proven by their theft of valuable intellectual property and agreements with Russia to circumvent economic sanctions triggered by the invasion of Ukraine. As you know, I'm going to ask the question to Dr. McDowell. The Russia invasion of Ukraine, it's already been over 15 months. So what lessons should the United States government take from how we utilize sanctions when assessing the possibility of a similar impending attack by the Chinese towards Taiwan?
Yes, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. So I think the lessons we can take from the sanctions against Russia, I would say before the war and after, again, are that they provoke our adversaries to move into alternative currencies. In fact, they sort of require it, right, because targets cannot use the dollar system, and so they're forced to move into other currencies. We've seen, again, leading up to the war, Russia settling more trade with China in euros, settling more trade with China in the yuan. We've seen that increase with the focus on the yuan and then rubles after the invasion and the new rounds of sanctions. And so in one sense, that's a sign that sanctions are working, because if sanctions are working, countries will have to move their activities away from the dollar. But it's also a sign that sanctions do not stop countries like Russia or China from participating in the world economy. There are limitations to how effective they can be. And so again, I think the bigger lesson here is about thinking about how to use sanctions in a way that doesn't provoke additional sort of infrastructure building that will weaken the effectiveness of those in the future.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, may I offer 3 or 4 specific things I think we need to learn from what did and didn't work? First is, you can't make vague, unspecified threats in the run-up to hostilities. You have to begin imposing consequences before the assault begins. Lesson number 2, you cannot piecemeal sanctions on banks when it comes to state-controlled autocratic systems, because they simply use the non-sanctioned banks to get around it. Lesson number 3, you have to go after the thing that they export, which is giving them the hard currency reserves to keep the war effort going, and we have not done that with regard to Russian oil. So those, I think, are 3 major deficiencies that we need to fix. To the chairman's point earlier, I've served as an acting Assistant Secretary of Defense and Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, as well as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and I can tell you the Treasury does not sufficiently plan in advance for these kinds of consequences. We need to urge Treasury to come up with a serious game plan to go after the Chinese if we believe invasion of Taiwan is imminent.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of your perspectives on that and the lessons that we can take from it. But we should all be troubled by the increase of central bank swap line agreements deployed by the People's Bank of China. According to 2021 CBOC report, it said that it has swap facilities with 40 countries with a combined capacity of almost $4 trillion yen, or about $570 billion. And just a few days ago, Argentina a country facing a deep currency devaluation and 109% annual inflation, they announced a deal to renew its currency swap line with China and double the amount it can access to nearly $10 billion. So the PCOC justifies the swap lines as a way to force countries to utilize the yen as a method of exchange. So I want to ask you, Mr. Billingsley, instead of liberalizing its capital account and allowing the yen to be fully convertible into the currency exchange markets, the CCP has opted its increase into its bilateral swap line agreements to further internationalize its currency. So is there anything that the United States can do to slow down or reduce adaptation of the PCOC's current swap lines?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm not an expert on credit swaps, but we have some here, so I defer to my colleagues.
Real quick, my own reaction here is that the swap lines have been, initially were pitched as a way to promote the use of RMB in trade settlement. There are some studies that show that there's a slight increase in trade settlement in yuan when a country has a swap line, but they're not transformational. Now it seems like in the case of Argentina, they're being used more as a way to help these countries that have found themselves heavily indebted to Chinese state-owned banks and the Chinese government to effectively get access to RMB to save their dollar reserves. To be honest, I think the use of the swap lines from Argentina is actually a symbol of the dollar strength and the reliance of countries like Argentina on the dollar than a sign of the yuan strength.
Gentlelady's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well, and I thank the witnesses. I concur with those who have indicated that your testimony has been stellar. I greatly appreciate what you have said, while I may not agree with all of what has been said. It seems that in life, I have been relegated the duty to ask the most sensitive questions. So please forgive me for asking what will appear to be a super sensitive question. But there's a reason for it. And please also carefully consider your answer, because you'll be photographed. I have in my office answers that have been photographed to super sensitive questions. Here's the question. If you consider yourself as someone who is not a white male, someone other than a white male, raise your hand, please. If you are something other than a white male, I believe there should be at least one hand. Thank you, doctor, for raising your hand. Let the record reflect that but one hand is up, and that is the hand of Dr. Carla, is it Norliff?
I get all kinds of pronunciations, but Norliff.
Thank you very much. I'm asking this question because Democrats can have but one witness. The doctor is the Democrats' one witness. We are witnessing white male privilege. You're the beneficiaries of it. You didn't create it. You didn't cause it. Someone on the other side should have said, guys, listen, these are all white men. This is super sensitive. You see, they become very much touched by this kind of questioning. But it's because we don't do this that the privilege continues. So let me ask you, all of you, do you know women who could testify here today? If you do, raise your hand. Reluctantly, all right. Let the record reflect that all persons knew women who could testify. Doctor, I assume you know a woman who could testify other than yourself?
Yes.
Thank you. So we have witnesses, women who are capable, competent, qualified, and who could do this. But the system continues as it is because there are people who are not sensitive enough to understand that this depiction of white men has an impact on society, has an impact on the little girls who look at this. I regret to have to do this, and I don't blame any of you, but it has to be done. There will be a photograph in my office with but one hand up when I did ask that sensitive question. Now, let's go on to something more conventional. Do threats of default have an adverse impact on the dollar as a global currency of choice? Do threats of default have an impact? If so, raise your hand. Raise your hand, please. Reluctantly so. Doctor, do you agree? If so, raise your hand.
I don't agree that threats. I do agree that defaulting would have adverse consequences.
But you don't think that saying the dollar we should default would have any impact?
I think it's mitigated by the dollar's safe haven status.
By the dollar's safe haven status? What is that, doctor?
That means that in times of crisis, the dollar actually increases in
All right,
strength.
well, let the record reflect that all but the doctor raised a hand indicating that threats of default can have an adverse impact. I mention this because we have a former president who regularly indicates that we should just let it default. That aids and abets those who are in the business of extorting, by the way. I don't agree with this. I think the dollar has supremacy because people know that we won't default and they believe in it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman of Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the panel. Again, a very esteemed panel, great testimony today. And again, I would say of our panels, this has by far been the one that I've most enjoyed, although we've had some great panels. Don't misread my comments. But, you know, as we talk about the significance of the U.S. dollar, you know, we have seen countries take actions to start move away or perhaps diversify away from the United States economy. You know, France has made oil deals with China and the yuan. The Malaysian Prime Minister said there's no reason to continue to solely rely on the U.S. But yet the dollar survived the Bretton Woods collapse, the launch of the European Union, the euro, the financial crisis. You know, we've discussed the stability and the depth and really the diversity of U.S. economy. But as we look at continuing to attract and continue to really kind of remain the dominant predator in the currency space, Mr. Goodspeed, what other incentives are there for countries to continue to ally with the United States? And then what do we need to do to continue to further those incentives?
I think first and foremost is to maintain a dynamic, large, growing economy, because that constitutes a center of gravity within the global economy, that people have to transact in dollars, they have to invoice in dollars, and the market for U.S. dollar-denominated debt remains, to say again, the deepest and most liquid in the world. I would also say we've had some discussion of innovation in cryptocurrency, in payment systems, and we want to make sure that we have a regulatory framework in place that allows for that innovation to occur within the United States versus without. And I would also add that low and stable inflation is important for stability in the dollar, and that's why it's essential that we get inflation back to target.
Well, you mentioned inflation, and you look at our current spending levels that have obviously created inflation within the United States. It has also created inflation abroad, as was mischaracterized previously. So as we look at the current administration, and you look at our debt levels, we're currently at roughly $32 trillion. We just added $4 to $5 trillion over the next 2 years. What impact do you see on the horizon if we don't get spending under control? It should also be noted that we don't have a revenue problem. Historically, revenues have only exceeded current levels to GDP a few times in recent history. So spending is the issue, not revenue.
Well, I would say it will over time as deficits mount and as the debt burden rises above 100%. I think the Congressional Budget Office has it ending the budget window at about 119% of our economy. Then we will probably observe an acceleration of diversification away from the dollar as a hedge. Again, I don't see another single currency displacing the dollar as the major international currency or as the major reserve currency, but continued diversification.
Mr. Billingsley, why was banning of the Alipay, the Q Wallet, and WeChat Pay vital to national security?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of that question.
Why was banning some of the alternative payment systems, CCP payment systems, important, imperative for national security?
Well, I think the CCP had a number of reasons for going after some of these. One, I think, had to do with some concern that some legitimate concern that the People's Bank of China had that they were providing credit in an unregulated fashion. Some of it is a control mechanism because Chairman Xi wants absolute and total control over the Chinese oligarchs as they are. So those are, I think, actions that motivated him. I defer to my colleagues on the effect for the U.S. economy, though.
Any further comments? All right. Well, you know, as we move forward, and we're about out of time, just really briefly, as we continue to see escalation from the CCP against Taiwan, what impact would that have really on the global economy? Not the U.S. dollar, but the economy. Anyone?
It would be catastrophic.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the ranking member for holding this. I want to compliment each of you being here based on both merit, but also a long lineage of successful insight into the strength of the U.S. dollar on the global economy. Now, it is my belief that we are not under immediate threat of the U.S. dollar being replaced as the world's reserve currency. However, there are developments here that I applaud this Congress in taking a leadership role in helping to drive. So, Mr. Billings, I'm going to begin with you, both in your defense service as well as at Treasury. In February of this year, the Office of Foreign Asset Control issued action against several Russian individuals and proxies accused of skirting one of the most aggressive, or at least so-called aggressive, sanction regimes in U.S. history. Could you please talk with us about how Russian individuals and defense firms like Rostec have been able to facilitate arms sales under this extreme sanction regime leveled by the president?
Congressman, some of the sanctions that this administration have imposed have been effective, and in particular, some of the actions taken against Russian oligarchs. Likewise, I think it's commendable that they have rallied the UK and the EU and even some Asian allies to further impose sanctions. But overall, the sanctions imposed by the Biden administration have not, in fact, been the strongest ever, as they've touted. They're riddled with loopholes and exceptions. We're in the process of allowing the Iranians to continue to cut billion-dollar deals with Rosatom, which is the organization which also, by the way, is expanding the Russian nuclear weapons stockpile, for instance. So it's not been comprehensive. We need to go after the full set of banks across the board, and we need to go after Russian oil exports. Otherwise, it prolongs the war.
Fully agree with you on that, and I compliment the fact that we have been able to work with our allies on this. The challenge, though, remains that there is a shadow network in which a lot of this is skirting U.S. sanctions, and we are losing the ability to control that. Specifically, let's talk about one of these, the Zemenkov network. It's beginning to chip away at U.S. foreign policy and the legitimacy of the U.S. dollar in just the way you highlighted. Tell me how one of these networks operates outside the U.S. control system.
Well, they do it in a lot of ways. I mean, Russia also partners with Hezbollah, for instance, in skirting sanctions on both sides of that equation. And they use jurisdictions which don't have really truly effective anti-money laundering regulations. And here I'm specifically talking about the Emirates. I'm talking about Turkey. We also see a lot of interest in Venezuelan gold. Largest gold reserves in the world are in Venezuela. And as I said earlier in testimony, that people love gold because it's anonymous. It's hard to trace. And you see those gold flows going up into Turkey, over to the Emirates, and then onward either into China, India, or Russia itself.
So what was just highlighted here is this idea that we are, weaponizing a network. Dr. McDowell, I want to speak to one of these points that you brought up during your opening here. When people talk of weaponizing currents, I would offer it's a mistake to assume that currency is the weapon beyond the monetary means. Really what we're talking about here, currency is just the payload. The real weapon is the underlying rails, the networks that these currencies and their corresponding payments and economic activity are transmitted on. Countries, companies, consortia, they control the rails and ultimately wield this as a real economic power. I'd like to highlight here, for the record, CELS, the blockchain payment network developed by Rosti in Russia. CHIPS, as was highlighted, a payment clearing settlement out of the communist Chinese currency. In 2022 alone, we saw over $14 trillion in transactions through this network in over 109 countries. So the question I have here is that, can you elaborate on how China's development of the cross-border interbank payment system, known as CHIPS, has facilitated an alternative payment network for clearing these settlements outside U.S. networks?
Sure. So CIPS, essentially what we're talking about here is a Chinese replication of CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payments System in the United States. And what that is a system of correspondent banking accounts between hubs. These are big global banks to which thousands of smaller banks are connected and have shared accounts with, right? And so if you think about when you move around the country in an through airplane, right, you're connecting in a major hub, connects all the smaller airports. It's sort of what we're talking about. And CIPS has something like 70 direct participants. These are all Chinese state-owned banks that are at the core of the CIPS network. And they're connected to now around 1,400 indirect participants. Some of these are in China, but they're in over 100 countries now. That doesn't mean that all of those banks are participating in it, but again, they're hooked up to the plumbing, right? So essentially it's a
and
different
Dr.
plumbing
McDowell,
system.
agreed, this is fantastic. I want to highlight this point here though. Between CIPS and CEL, the Russian version of this, are we effectively isolating the United States out of this, and is it a threat to the U.S.?
I don't think it's a threat to the U.S. Again, I think it's more a tool for China to improve its resiliency, right? It wants to have the plumbing in place. So if it gets caught in a Russia-like scenario, right, it already has that network and can, if it needs to, lean more heavily on it. It's already using it, but it's marginal right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, to go to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luke DeMeyer, for holding this hearing today. Now, this hearing comes at a critical time when some academics and naysayers are spreading theories that de-dollarization has begun and that the beginning of the end has arrived for the dollar's dominant role as a global reserve currency. I want to start off with some basic observations and questions for our witnesses. But before I do that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a recent report from Moody's Investor Service dated May 25th, 2023. Dollar dominance will persist for decades despite new challenges.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as our witnesses all know, the U.S. dollar enjoys a reserve currency advantage over competing foreign currencies, which provides benefits to the United States in several ways, including in trade, finance, and in financing our unsustainable debt. In this report, the Moody's report, it concludes that despite the likely emergence of a multipolar currency system over the coming decades, the global financial system will still be led by the greenback because its challengers will struggle to replicate its scale, safety, and convertibility in full. Professor Faulkner, would you agree with this assessment?
I would. There is no other viable competitor out there immediately that has the depth of markets, the international trade, and that other countries want claims against our future economy the way that our competitors would offer.
Thank you. Is there a genuine risk that the dollar could lose its reserve currency status in the short to medium time frame?
Not in the short to medium time frame, but that doesn't mean we don't need to long-term address some of these challenges.
And Dr. Goodspeed, would you agree with Professor Falkender's remarks, and could you expand on them?
Sure, and I would just like to note that there are a couple of figures floating around in terms of how big a share of foreign exchange transactions are accounted for by the dollar, 45% or 90%. It depends on what you're looking at. I tend to think that the ranking member's number of 90% is more informative because it tells us what share of transactions is the dollar involved with on either side. I would echo Dr. Falkender's remarks in terms of, in the near term, it's very hard to see a displacement of the US dollar. You can't replace something with nothing, or you can't replace a reserve currency with the attributes of the US dollar with a reserve currency like the euro or renminbi that doesn't share those attributes. Over the long term, we do need to address the risk that investors no longer view the US dollar and US dollar denominated assets as the safest and most liquid in the world.
Thank you both. Switching gears, I'd like to move to China and the yuan. Mr. Billingsley, during your time at the Treasury Department, you dealt extensively with Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. What do you make of Saudi Arabia's off-again, on-again flirtations with Chinese officials, as reported by the Wall Street Journal last year, regarding dominating oil contracts in the yuan?
Well, I think it's a huge issue, but it's a huge issue because it actually reflects a massive miscalculation on the part of the Biden administration when it comes to the Saudis. You can't demonize the royal family and then go crawling back to them and asking them to increase oil production and then demonize them again and ignore them. And of course, you're going to see the Chinese step into the gap. And that's precisely what they've done in brokering normalization of diplomatic ties between the Saudis and the Iranians. The Chinese have one ambition here, which is to ensure that in the midst of a Taiwan invasion, their access to oil from Saudi Arabia will be unimpeded.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, our members have all asked their questions, and with that, I'd like to thank our witness for your testimony today. You all were fabulous. Thank you so much for your time and your attention and your ideas and discussions that we've had with you. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for their witnesses to the chair, which I will be forward to the witness with further response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. With that, this hearing is adjourned.